So I don't know, when you think about the modern world, it's weird. I sort of think about like how me and my wife sit down to try to plan out how we're going to retire. We got a plan. And the plan is all about practicality and utility. And the plan always changes, and then it becomes something we didn't think it was going to be at all. And there was a plan in Ukraine to sort of throw Hunter Biden under the bus in order to acquire some rights to some oil and get the right people in power in Ukraine. And the Trump administration decided to do all this in order to win an election in 2020. And then all hell broke loose. And Andrew Favorov, our guest today, is the guy who was approached to get the dirt on Hunter Biden and ended up in the news, and whose life was changed. And the plan that Giuliani had turned out to be something very different. And this is me introducing you to our guest today. Plans are great, but people and loving them seem way more important. People are more important than plans. Plans get sideways. Today on Everything's Lightly, Andrew Favorov. Okay, Andrew, we're back together. Thanks for coming. We were just at Art of Tamada together, and you were kind of a highlight, I think. We'll talk about that maybe later. That was a fundraiser that you came to, and actually you're a supporter of First Things. Thanks for being here. Your story's fascinating. You've created a beautiful piece of art. I want to talk about a script and for potentially kind of a blockbuster thing that I want to talk about with you. But let's just start with who you are and why you are weirdly Russian and American at the same time, and how you got involved with Rudy Giuliani and kind of made yourself into the news here in America. So tell us what we think we should know as we go through this conversation.
Yeah, well, I was born in Moscow back in 75, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, my father, who is a world-renowned epidemiologist and virologist, was invited to come work for CDC in Atlanta. So in the early 90s, we moved to Atlanta, and as the country that I was part of, Soviet Union, was collapsing, and in fact collapsed while we were in the United States. So it's a strange experience when you're born and sort of live life as usual in one country, and then it ceases to exist. And the institutions and infrastructures that you have around you no longer function. And I think this experience, as I talk to people from all over the world, frankly, is becoming more and more common and more relevant as we, in this modern life, are getting severed from those places that we came from. We are faced with the questions of, well, who am I? Where do I come from? Where's my home, per se? And this sort of the global migration, the globalization as such, is making these autonomous people, kind of like myself, more and more around the world, people without the home. But I came to U.S., and I think thanks to my mom and thanks to the fact that I didn't speak much English at the time, I spent a summer going to Emory Library, and I've read all the works of Dostoevsky in basically a period of about 3 months. And as a friend of mine said, there's only two ways after that. You either go commit suicide or you go become Christian. And so what I found is I went to Orthodox Church. My mom took me. I was 15, 16 years old. And I got baptized in the faith. And I think that that's the root of the true identity that I came to know and appreciate only as I went through my trials and tribulations. But it's always been a place of the center of the ground. That's
how you know yourself, through your. Was it like that when you were a teen? So it was in your late teens that were you already baptized Orthodox, and you sort of said, Oh, this is who I am? No, you were just baptized as a 16-year-old.
Yeah, I was a product of a Soviet communist kind of leanings where people weren't baptizing their kids anymore. And but it's really reading the Idiot Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and The Devils, all in basically one settings.
So your mother, what'd she think of you being this independent, dipped in the water Orthodox cat as you were a grown person? What'd she think of that?
Well, she was the one that actually urged it. She was the one that said, listen, because she was baptized when she was a kid and she drew a lot of her strength from that. My father is more of a scientist. I think he has more complicated relationship with faith. But because of my mom and because of the love that she had for me and for the church and for the grace, she took that initiative and brought me in. And I was ready because of all the work that Dostoevsky has done to my mind. I was a strange feeling to emerge out of that deep dive into all his works. I don't frankly recommend it.
What? Okay, now you got me on Dostoevsky. This could take a while, guys, but I could spend. I want to. Okay, before we get into the conversation that, in some ways, led you to write the script, which is this real life political intrigue, where you were. I remember watching you on the news, man. Here's a question: do you think Dostoevsky can be known to Americans the way it became known to you? Or is it a Russian thing?
I think a yes and a no. I think it's a question of sort of the commitment. Whenever you start going deep into into a different culture from yours, it requires a more effort. It's not impossible, but it requires a dedication, commitment, time, and effort to walk through it and work through it. And so I think Dostoevsky does speaks to the internal themes, right? He's a sort of the first to take the Nietzschean worldview to its maximum and show the emptiness behind it, and that if there is no God, that everything is allowed, everything is permissible. I guess that's the way to translate his famous quote. And he shows what happens to his characters when they adopt this, when they don't have that connection to anything more transcendent than them themselves, and how ultimately anything that you pursue in life that is not God is not the highest. And if it's not the highest, it's always going to crumble at one point or the other. Maybe if not crumble, but at least would not give that full satisfaction that you can only find and discover through your relationship with the church and with Christ.
Yeah. So this deep meaning kind of crept into your life even as a young man, and then you got involved in business. Somewhere along the line, you're approached in Kiev by Americans, or at least proxies, in order to make sense of some big political maneuver that was involved with the Trump election in 2016. Can you get us to that point, and then how your faith or how your worldview made that situation easier or harder? Or can you speak to that? First, tell us what happened with these chats, tell us what happened in terms of your relationship to American politics and Ukraine, the energy business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I actually studied in my undergraduate, studied philosophy and psychology, and those were the things that were very close to me. I really enjoyed it, but apparently there's not a lot of good paying jobs for the philosophers out there. At least there wasn't back then. And I ended up going to get my master's of business administration here at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And it was a great program. I mean, I think it still had a lot of that Jesuit ethic to it. And I think I learned a few principles there that sort of made the faith more practical from the standpoint of how should you behave in any given situation. And we had this great ethics professor, and I remember him saying, if you thinking about whether you should do thing or not do thing, imagine it's on the front page of Wall Street Journal the next morning, whatever you've done, honestly being reported, and make decision coming out from that standpoint, from that vantage point.
Wow.
And that's
That happened to you. So you remember that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I used it as a guideline. But after Georgetown, so I went to work for this great company, AES, and was founded by two wonderful gentlemen, very Christian, very men of faith. And it was, at the time, it was probably the largest competitor to Enron. We all know how Enron blew up. AES survived, but it survived with 28 assets, 28 presence in 28 countries around the world, including our favorite country, Georgia. So I came in to work for them in 2005, and in 2000, right as I was coming in, they were selling off Georgia to the local business group because the CFO of the Georgian assets got murdered in his apartment because he kept on insisting that people pay for their electricity bill, especially large industrial customers that didn't want to do that particularly. But I started out in 2005 in Kazakhstan. My first job, my first assignments took me to Afghanistan, Pakistan. This is 2005, Afghanistan, and there were still a lot of shootings going on, and it was pretty close to being dangerous, to being a war zone. But the idea, what I always pursued in my career, was bringing power to the people. Bringing power in this particular case actually means the physical power that would make your Wi-Fi work, and that gives us an opportunity to have this interview. And so I traveled a lot of Central Asia, spent some time in Russia, London, Mozambique, Cameroon, South Africa, Turkey, basically building power plants and selling electricity to consumers. But in 2009, right after the crisis, I got a job offer to come work in Ukraine. My wife didn't want to come live in Cameroon, where I was stationed at the time. So I packed up and came to Ukraine, and I fell in love with the place. And it's been 15 years since I built my life there and built my career there. I started working as a commercial director for this large oil and gas and electricity company. Then I ran my own trading company of natural gas in Ukraine. At the time, it was the largest private importer and exporter of natural gas, the largest trader. But to cap off my experience, I was asked to become a number 2 at the largest state-owned oil and gas company, Naftagaz. And at one of the conferences in Houston that you go to as an oil and gas executive, I was approached by 2 gentlemen, one of whom I knew from my dealings way back when, that were pretty close to the folks with Giuliani. And they basically said, hey, listen, so we're going to be canning the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and together with an ambassador, we want to can the CEO of the company, my boss. And why don't you take this position, provided that you buy some liquefied natural gas from our company and give us a good deal? And I was pretty shocked, because it's not something that you expect, right? You almost expect it from the Ukrainians. That's sort of a normal way of doing business back in the old country. But I didn't expect it from the United States, especially from the associate of a well-known Giuliani.
Had Trump won the election at that point?
Yeah, this is 2019 or 2020. So this was before
it's later. It's later. Yeah.
This is when, on the basis of this, his first impeachment happened, because there was all these, if you remember, he ended up firing the ambassador, and then there
this started the whole impeachment process. This was some of the factual evidence supposedly that led to his impeachment.
Correct. Led to his impeachment. It wasn't, the Senate didn't. The Senate acquitted him, and but it sort of exposed, I think, for the first time so clearly in the paper, really how the sausage is made in the American politics, and it's frankly not that different from any other country in the world.
Tell me, were they trying to? That part of the quid pro quo, the back and forth, the quid pro quo, was information about Hunter Biden. Is that correct?
Yeah, Hunter Biden was amongst other things that they were fishing for, they were hunting for, but in the process, they wanted to see if they can leverage their political influence into good old natural gas deals and LNG deals and deliver them into Ukraine.
So this is in your lap sitting there in Houston. What were you thinking next? Where do you turn at that point?
Well, funny you bring this up, but I did have a very clear message in my head from the ethics professor. Like,
That's right.
imagine if this is tomorrow shows up on Wall Street Journal front page. How are you going to feel? So I politely declined. I mean, so you certainly don't want to be an asshole about it because you don't know how you're going to pan out. Politely declined, and then went to my old partner and a mentor of sorts and shared the story with him. And I think that he was so frustrated with the politics and the Trump administration that he felt that he should leak it to the press because it would do some damage to Trump. And unfortunately, I got caught up in that because he leaked it. And next thing I know, I remember this quite vividly. My daughter, it was participating in a running competition, and I went to support her. And as she was approaching the finish line, she started throwing up. So I kind of run over there, try to pick her up and help her across the finish line. And that's when my phone starts ringing off the hook, like 20 different numbers at the same time, right at that moment.
Wow.
I finally pick up, and it's the journalist from AP, I think, wanting to get feedback and wanting to get comments. And I was completely taken aback by what's happened. And didn't expect quite this. I mean, when publicity hits you for the first time, man, it's a beast, that's for sure. And
It's a beast, right? It just keeps coming.
It's a beast, and it's sort of, there's this thought in the back of my head that it's like, listen, if I don't tell my story, somebody else will tell it for me, and I will have to try to crawl my way out from underneath this thing for the rest of my life. And so thankfully I got a good lawyer, I got a good PR guy. We were able to get sort of my side of the story out. I was able to be debriefed by all the relevant authorities, explain everything that happened. But man, for 15 minutes there, the infamous 15 minutes of fame is something that you're not really, you don't know how much you're not prepared for it until it hits you.
Well, two things. One is your daughter wasn't vomiting because she heard the news first, right? She was vomiting because she was at the very end of her race.
Correct.
Now I wanted to clear that up. I'm sure some listeners were like, wait a minute. Here's the real question is, this is all boomeranging back in Ukraine, right? I mean, this is causing you problems back there, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's when I had this crazy idea here that I am an energy guy, but I'm like, and I remember clearly like sitting in my apartment and watching CNN during this the hearings, and I'm like, everybody's throwing out facts or narratives. Trump is good. Trump did nothing wrong. Trump is bad. He's corrupt. But it is two heads or three heads or five heads screaming at each other and trying to score points, but nobody cares really about the story itself. What had happened? What is the arc? Who is the hero? What's the first act, second act, third act? But there is such a story as to, and this is 2020, and I'm like, the country of Ukraine, which always strikes me because it translates as the edge, right? The edge, according to Jonathan Peugeot, is where all the monsters come out to play. That's where all the weird things, the upside down world happens. And here I was at the edge, and it was the center of the attention of the world at the time. And then I think back, like literally, Ukraine over the last 20 years had two revolutions, impeachment of one president of the United States, almost impeachment of the second one. I mean, we're still kind of in that story with Hunter Biden just recently getting pardoned over this. The son of the vice president at the time, sitting on the board of Burisma, which is the Ukrainian oil and gas company, who I known quite well. And I thought to myself, listen, that I have all this inside as it's sort of information to the story, to the characters. And there's so much drama around the revolutions, the war, the politics of it all, the impeachments. I think I would say double impeachments with you to do with the Ukraine. But what is the story? And everybody I always talk to, it's like they know pieces and bits, but they don't have the story that ties it all together. And important to say, not into a narrative, because there's plenty of guys on Twitter, on Fox News, on CNN, on MSNBC that try to tie it up into a narrative to make their guys look good and the other guys look not so good. And the other thing that sort of inspired me at the time, I was watching Narcos, which is essentially, at one hand, it's a story of illegal cocaine trade, but on the other side, it's the story of a modern Colombia and the events that shaped modern Colombia and into what it is today. It's still living in the aftermath of this. And so I got together with this renowned producer out of Hollywood, Brian Etheridge. He was part of basically every top show out there on television. We locked ourselves up in an office right across the street from the Parliament building in Kyiv for about a year. We got a team of about 10 girls and boys and guys. And we broke down the series. We broke down the TV series. We wrote a pilot, and we wrote sort of the idea of how it's going to develop over the next seasons to tell the depths of that story. And as we're working on it, I start... we put a period on the script. We put the final touches on it the day before they start bombing Kyiv. And 2 days before they start bombing Kyiv, my son was born, my 3-year-old Plato, I call him. So it just felt like the entire thing was converging into something. It was pregnant with meaning. And, and I thought what I realize now is that at the time, my vintage point was very much a modern man from within the modernity, looking at all these events as to how the modern political world, be that in Ukraine, in the United States, or anywhere else, really works. And but it's limiting, because it's the whole concept of modernity is you reduce the phenomena to something that you can measure and explain, to something that you can quantify, and then you try to operate within these parameters. But the fundamental...
And use that thing. It's really about using that thing then that you've quantified and using it for power.
Using it
to
for
acquire
power.
power, to maintain power.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. And that's sort of the crux of where we're going with this series. And but in order to be able to truly appreciate it and comprehend it, you got to grab yourself by your ears, your mental ears, and drag yourself out of the mindset that you don't even realize that you're in. Because
that's what you call, that's the modern mindset. It's not, you're not trying to say bad or good. It's what we've become. Is it something like that?
It's sort of like, we've been trained since the young age, by the kindergarten, the school, the universities, of how to evaluate and what parameters to use within the system that we talked about, the system of modernity. And you look at everything in the world from the perspective of power, of money, of, so your scope for analyzing phenomena and the events that transpire is within the system of modernity that, let's say, Hobbes has helped to create.
That's right. It's Hobbesian, John Locke, and all these characters. On the show, we call it light people. It's a play on white people. It's not about white people. There's plenty of brown, red, yellow people that are light people. In fact, I would argue globalism is the attempt to lighten everyone and to enlighten everyone to a type of being, a way of thinking. That's what so interested me when you came to Art of Tamada is, bro, you don't fit. And then your answer to what you were, which we talked about at Art of Tamada, which you just spoke about, was I'm an Orthodox Christian. And then I could understand your analysis. It's very interesting, because you really don't, you cross all these lines with your experiences, and then this experience in particular about corruption. And so what's a takeaway now as you sit with Brian Etheridge and you have this beautiful script, which is really good, guys. I got to read the pilot. And how are you feeling about modernity, and how will your sovereign state script enlighten us to it?
Well, I think, one thing is, in order to be able to comment on something, you have to be outside of it in order to be able to understand how it works. It's sort of the fish cannot really comment on the nature of water that it swims to, because it is the nature, it is the thing that you're in. And it's impossible to try to inquire from the fish what is the purpose of the bridge, because it's an impossibility. But I went undergone the sort of the transformation and returning over the last 3 years since the war broke out to my Orthodox self, to my Orthodox roots, because that gives you the vantage point that is outside of the system of modernity, that tries to reduce your mind, reduce your soul, if you will, to that can be measured and controlled and manipulated.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, I think the age of enlightenment gave us, I like to call him a three-headed dragon, the dragon of the fraternity, liberty, and equality. So other ways is communism, fascism, and libertarianism. And I think we're so trained by the last 400 years of our common experience, to a large extent, the modern man that is, that we think that these are the only three options that are available.
Wow.
And having the only three options, so that you see that the people are often talking past each other. Like when you observe a man of faith talking to a modern man, is if they're speaking different languages. And enlightenment, in essence, and I think you made a very good point, it reduces our experience to the struggle for power, not to struggle to love or to open yourself up through love to something transcendent, but to the power to enforce change or manipulate people or to get some sort of resource or result. So the idea with the sovereign state, and I think the name really spoke to me, and we went through a few, but the concept of the sovereign state, I mean, on one hand, it's a nation state, right? And we've been living since the age of modernity, since the Peace of Westphalia, in this concept of a nation state, when the ruler, the king, is the one that determines the faith of his people. So we have the political power, in sense, overcoming the spiritual guidance, the spiritual focus, because of that settlement of Peace in Westphalia. So that leads, this is the early stages with Hobbesian philosophy, Locke, and the rest of the light guys, as you call them. They start structuring within the modernity, how is it that we should coexist without killing each other? And because otherwise, the great fear that Hobbes was always speaking of is the fact that, in our pursuit of heaven on earth, we're going to end up killing each other and exterminate each other, because Catholics might see it one way or the Protestants might see it the other way, but it will lead to murder and devastation. So let's try to pretend that the God is outside of our sphere of analysis. They kick the God out of the framework that we spoke about. And let's just try to deal with it in there. But, and this is, I think, a testament to Jonathan Peugeot's work, but you can't have the transcendent purpose become subservient to a political structure, be that a nation or state. So from one component, we analyze the sovereign state from the perspective of a nation state, how the themes that are eternal themes get unfolded through the modern history of Ukraine. So if there is a pattern of a community, a global pattern, like eternal pattern of the community, part of the eternal history, that, Old Testament speaks incessantly about, the warning against the traps and the right way to build a community and the wrong way to build a community. And so does the New Testament. But if we remove from this community the sense of the transcendent and leave it up to us humans to structure it. What is the sovereign state has and what its limitations, and what are some of the conflicts that are necessarily embedded in this creation of ours, the sovereign state. But also the sovereign state, there has a second meaning, is the state of sovereignty. How do I myself have a sense of sovereignty? And what does the sovereignty truly mean? And, and Jordan Hall had a great podcast with Vervaeke that I recommend about I think that's something to do with governance, where he spends good 20 minutes speaking about the concept of the sovereign state, sovereign individual, and themes that are embedded in it. But ultimately, I think that the true sovereignty, you always have to ask, who do I get it from? If you say the state when I am born and gives me a passport and a birth certificate kind of anoints the identity on you, you living within the national sovereign state, you are also facing the very limitations of that sovereignty that has been given to you. If you yourself give yourself a sovereignty and you say, listen, I am my own person, I declare myself sovereign. Well, that's you start traveling down this whole Nietzschean nihilism.
Different set of limitations.
Correct.
Also a different set of limitations, yeah.
So what I would put forth, and maybe this is the spoiler, but I think that this is what I got to in my journey with the script, with this project, is that the ultimate sense of sovereignty you can only get from the transcendent. And so what is your identity is Orthodox Christian. It's not Russian. It's not American. It's not Ukrainian, even though I lived there for 15 years. My kid is Ukrainian. I have a permanent residence there. But it's the identity that it's transcended each single one of those identities. And yes, the national identities or the identities that I bestow upon myself are hopefully incorporated within my Orthodox Christian identity. But it's
right. Well, it speaks to a different type of. This is one of the issues with the light person or the light people, the Enlightenment, is that it can't know truth in a layered way and still be purely scientific, because the purely scientific can't account for the nuance. They can't account for the leftovers. They can't account for the spiritual nature of our being. And what I think you're saying beautifully is the spiritual reality of our being actually is the first and most important. You can call it the foundation, or you can call it the most important, highest good that allows us to understand the rest. If we don't have the spiritual narrative about our being, we'll never get to the narrative, a proper narrative in the physical, or in other words, the scientific narrative itself will be off if we don't have a spiritual center, I think. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, and I think, there are things that can be measured and things that can't be measured by reason, by rulers, by microscopes, by telescopes, and everything else. And so I think we're living in the tail end of the experiment, of a 400-year Enlightenment experiment that said, listen, let's not worry about the stuff that can't be measured. If it can be measured, it's not real. Yeah. It doesn't affect you. Let's focus on only the things that can be measured. And but I think in every decision that you make, there are trade-offs and the assumptions. And we had that 400-year run where these assumptions, I think the war in Ukraine, I think to a large extent is showing the shortcomings of these assumptions of the modern state.
What about, this brings me to your thought on the Peace of Westphalia. So essentially, folks out there may or may not know, that's the end of the Protestant wars, essentially, where Europe's tired out and they basically say, let's just keep God out of the main square so that we can all get along at least on some level. Do you think the transcendent also has to come with violence and struggle and all that? I mean, do you think if we identify first as Orthodox Christians, here's the skeptic. Yeah, you'll just fight as an Orthodox Christian because, I mean, deep down you're an animal. So thanks for the transcendent part, but you just end up acting like everybody else anyway. What do you say to somebody like that?
Well, I mean, as the war in Ukraine is showing, the critics would be absolutely right. The Orthodox Christians are killing each other. One Orthodox Christian country is invading another. But you know, and I might have shared this with you, but if you don't mind me repeating, I'd actually like to share it with the audience. What I'm struck
Please.
by is the way, and this is to answer your question, the way that the Paul's letter to the Romans 2:12, I believe, gets translated in three different traditions. So the quote goes, and I'm paraphrasing it, please forgive me, but do not be tempted or moored with this world, but let your heart be changed by Jesus. And I use the word changed here, but in three traditions, the word changed is translated differently. In a Catholic Latin tradition, it's translated as let Jesus reform your heart. And I think that speaks to the crux of the sort of the maybe Catholic worldview in a sense, because you have a form, and through Jesus, your relation with Jesus, the things within this form get rearranged. And you deal with an outside world through rearranging the things within your heart, within who you really are. In an English tradition, and let expand it to the Protestant tradition, that word is translated as transform. So you have a triangle. Okay, let's make it into a square, and then the Jesus will live and work through your life, and then you won't have to kill each other. Um, and actually, I think it's just so fascinating that the same word transform is being used around the trans debate and the arguments that it's taking place in the political, because again, the concept there is if you discover your quote unquote true self, then you will be transformed and you will belong. That's the sort of the dream that is being sold.
That's right.
But in Orthodox tradition, in the Greek tradition, the word is translated as metamorphosis. So metamorphosize your heart. And that to me speaks to a lot more organic of a feeling. And organic in a sense that you accept yourself as part of this living tree and an organism, and you are growing together with the church and letting Jesus metamorphosize your heart so that you are at peace with your neighbor, so you can love God and love your neighbor. And I think that that's the promise of Orthodoxy, that is held in those differences. But at the same time, we have to say that we're people. We're people, and the people.
Yeah, this is it, right? This is it. This is the hard part.
The hard part, yeah. And so instead of trying to working on metamorphosing or transforming your heart or letting Jesus do that work, we try to grab power and go and transform our neighbor into something that we want him to be. Sort of like what a Russian Federation does. It grabs the power and says, I'm going to bomb and kill and maim until you become what it is that I want you to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, wow, what a brilliant analysis. I think it's just it's the temptation of Babylon, right? It's the temptation of Cain early on. It's what happens to us when we imagine that we're God on some level.
Correct.
Because let's just face it, bro. We do that. We asked this question, especially coming up. I came up in the 70s and 80s. Come up here meaning I was a youth. I was a youth in the 70s and 80s. And no offense to anybody in the 70s and 80s, including my own mom and dad, especially my dad. But I was sort of trained to grab the power. And they were Christians and good people. I'm not even blaming them at all. They're beautiful. In fact, through them, I've been led to a more peaceful self. But that was the point of my education. No offense. I know people out there are nodding their head right now. I was supposed to use my education, to use my work, to get what I wanted. That is the point of why I exist. And When you say Russia does that, no doubt. It's the imperial inclination, right? The problem is it's not them or us. It's my soul. It's what it's become when I'm not operating sort of as I was meant to operate. So I don't. That's not really a question.
I mean, but I think I agree with your observations. It's you know, if there's something broken, there's this temptation to go and fix it. Or if you, but then you never ask yourself, is it really broken? Am I going to do a good job fixing it? Should it be fixed? Maybe there is a reason why it's this way. Or do I have the right instruments and tools to actually
Did someone ask me?
And did somebody ask me? And did somebody request this? Or am I going out there and I'm going to force the good upon the unsuspecting people around me? And that's the temptation that I think is present in the life of every single one of us. And but I think the modernity, the Enlightenment, said that it's not a temptation; it's your duty and responsibility.
Wow. And I think your script. Well, so the reason I love this thing, one is it makes me laugh. This is really important. When you guys read this, or God willing, when you see it, we'll talk about where it is and it's where it needs to go, because I know you guys are on some level you're in the you're trying to figure out how to produce this thing. But what I love about it is it speaks to the human absurdities. The narrative is hilarious, and yet it's a comedy that is a proper old ancient comedy. Is that it's tragic, right? There's something there's a sadness in it. Yeah. Can you speak to that why you wrote it this way, why it sounds this way?
Well, I think before the war, and I mean, as you read this, you know that it sort of all ends up with a war. Another comparable that we like to use is Chernobyl, the TV series. Chernobyl is going to blow up. You know how it ends, but there, there's sort of this sense of anticipation and suspense that keeps the viewer so committed and attached, and the great writing and production that those guys did. And but the last 20 years before the war, I mean, Ukraine was sort of a crazy place without many rules. And that was that temptress that so many people, including a president, a son of a president, an American mayor, and everybody else, Putin, and, you name it, they all sort of got attached to it and thought that they can set it right and get it to do what it is that they want it to do. And that there is such a comic element to it, because you come in and you try to fix something that perhaps can't be fixed, or you fixing it is making it even worse for everybody involved.
Yeah.
And so it starts off in my career, in this, the main character is loosely based on my story, but my career was in natural gas. And you think about Ukraine, you think natural gas, you think, Burisma, you think my story with Naftogaz, you think Nord Stream 1 and 2 that were blown up once the war started, that delivered most of the Russian gas to Europe, which is a major sort of story. And the objective was not, in a sense, to keep the viewer entertained, but to tell the story in such a way that it's not a preachy drama. And it's more of an adventure of these three crazy Americans.
And a spiritual one on some level. That's what's cool about the.
Yeah, but I think what we're planning on doing is that, we're going to try all the dead ends of modernity first. The main characters are going to try to do all the dead ends of modernity first. Okay, I think about it in terms of left hand, right hand, the order and chaos, the two maximum. But so that's where we have one president that comes in and tries to impose through his will the structure on Ukrainian society and make it function by rules, but instead ends up breaking it in the revolution. And then the other one tries to do it through the Gnostic sort of temptations of nationalism, of Gnostic temptations of managerial state, the deep state so-called. And we're going to try to show the limits of that as well as the management structure, as the way of structuring reality. So the main character...
Here's Zelensky. Is that Zelensky?
No, Zelensky is the sort of the final one. I mean, I think, and it's from the drama perspective, it's so interesting because he was a clown before he became the president. He was a successful TV producer that made comedies. It's fascinating that he got elected basically on the back of a TV series about him playing a come-from-nowhere president of Ukraine and changing the country. And I think it speaks so much to the moment as well, because we have a person playing the president, becoming the president. In US, we have the person playing the decision maker on Apprentice, becoming the president. So it's sort of controlling the narrative is what gets you into the real positions of power and the real decision making. But again, this is something that Jonathan speaks about so often, the upside down world. So we have a place on the edge that might drag us all into World War III that is being run by a guy that used to be a former clown. And how upside down of a world does it get? Does it get any more than that as an upside down world? And what are the inner human dynamics? What is the relationships like? What are the hard decisions are like? And which one of them, I think the fundamental question that we want to explore is who is taking the responsibility for the decisions that they're making? Because the people, then as they come to power and they say, hey, I'm responsible before the people. But fundamentally, who are they responsible before? Who is going to be judging them?
Guys, we'll get right back to that. But first, it's the end of the year. Give money to First Things. Here's why. We send people for 2 years, but here's what happens when they get out there. They are totally transformed. We've sent lots of people, 40, 50 people. All kinds of hell breaks loose inside their souls. And when they come home, they're like really beautiful, active people. We should have a podcast with just those guys that have returned. Anyway, here's my point to you. I want you to be a monthly donor. $15. And then what happens is we take those $15 from, let's say, 1,500 of you. And now someone's doing the math going, oh my God, they're going to be rich. Not really, okay? When you send people around the world and then try to train them and do it ain't cheap, but it's cool. It's the coolest, profoundest way to make a difference in a local community that you would call impoverished. It's to simply be present, build projects. Be present, build projects. $15. 25 would be better. Once a month. And then come and join me on some phone calls, become a co-producer on our film, come to the restaurant, eat for free. I might say that. These are the words of an advertisement, and this advertisement for First Things is over. $25 a month. Do it. Back to the show. You talk about sort of three, it's like power without responsibility, wealth without risk, glory without sacrifice. Those are some themes in the screenplay, and it really hit me. Glory without sacrifice. I just think that's such our high school students in the United States have now just understood that you can just get what you want and be known for it without sacrifice. And it's built in that right now to the postmodern narrative. And I thought those were beautiful ways of identifying sort of the pattern of your narrative.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. But I think, those three things, especially glory without sacrifice, they do really well speak about our late state of modernity. It's like, why should I sacrifice to get what I want when let somebody else sacrifice while I get the glory of TikTok, Facebook, or the rest of them? That's right. And it is sort of, I think, in the sense that what unites the modern society that we find ourselves living in, what unites it is the desire to have it all without having to do anything for it and bear any responsibility for the result. And the
And that's the, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, and the ultimate sort of dead end of that, the dead end is the war, national disaster, or conflicts that exposes the unsustainability, unrealistic, the sort of the lie that is embedded in this attitude. And the only way you can have the unity, you can have something, you can have an identity, is through sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice is the God that was sacrificed for behalf of us humans, so we can be united around that sacrifice.
Which is interesting because that sacrifice is probably best characterized as martyrdom. And so in many ways, the Christian answer to like, why do you have to sacrifice is, well, you don't have to sacrifice. You can acquire. You can manipulate, acquire, manipulate, acquire, manipulate, acquire. But the problem is you can't manipulate and acquire your way out of death.
Yeah.
And so the problem, okay, so that should stop somebody. That let's just say we're just talking to Joe Blow. That should stop Joe Blow, regular secular citizen. And their answer at that point has to be, but at that point I'm dead and it doesn't matter. Now, the only problem I have now at that point with Joe Blow is, but that also means nothing else matters. In other words, it doesn't, I can just shoot you in the head right now, according to your own presuppositions. And so what you've really described to me now is a jungle and is a hell. Oh, by the way, and us as a bunch of animals. So it's not, you don't just get to say that because there's repercussions. There are outcomes to your anthropology and your philosophy. Sorry, I know it just seems like everything's fine because we're all dead and there's no meaning, except for that idea itself makes this place hell.
Yeah.
Because if you teach that for every one of us and we actually operate according to that, you've actually affected my life, not a little. You fundamentally ruined it on a lot of levels if all of us are operating according to your way of being. So I love how people try to like say, well, that's what you think, it's what I think. These things all come with repercussions. And to me, that's one reason why I'll speak on my country, and then I'll give it back to you because I'd love to hear what you think about this. I do think it's fundamentally irresponsible for the most powerful country in the world for the last 80 years to literally just basically call themselves or act as if they're secular, because they just create this hole in the middle where all the power is still being acquired by this machine, but there are no lessons being taught about what is beautiful or good. And so we all just sort of fall into this hole of, oh, we become like the thing that we are participating in. And I'm sorry, it's just what happens. And so how do you see the United States in all of this? Because I know you live here and you love it and it's part of your being. I mean, are you mad that I characterize the United States as this nihilist hole of hell, or what do you think?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there are several things. I mean, yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen. I have two wonderful children growing up in Georgia that I'm going to see for Christmas. So, and I think that this has been, the United States of America has been the greatest experiment in sovereignty and the sovereign state, to bring it back. But America is facing two fundamental problems. First is that the things that we hold to be self-evident are no longer are. So our society worked when founding fathers devised it and said, well, it's self-evident that there's Christ, that there's salvation, that there is God, that we have to be kind to our neighbors, and we have to love our Creator. And if the society shares these assumptions, which it did, which it did. Yeah, I mean, liberalism works like a charm. It's amazing because fundamentally the other guy is not going to screw you because he goes to the same church as you and he's going to have to see you, right? So he doesn't screw you. You don't have to beat him up. You don't have to beat him up. He doesn't have to, hit you over the head with something heavy. So that was one fundamental. We ran out of that assumption. It's no longer self-evident. And the second component, and Pavel and Jonathan, they both, who I consider to be my teachers, my sort of through this understanding, they both talk often about the challenge of multiplicity and unity in multiplicity, right? It's a miracle that we haven't killed each other yet. It is by the grace of God that we, in the pursuit of our individual happiness, have not started just stealing stuff from each other with everything that follows from that. But the way that the United States has the luxury of dealing with this. So when it was settled, and you have this community, Puritan community, and then somebody comes up with some other interpretation of the Bible, the community just says, listen, I don't want to fight you. There's a big West out there. Just keep driving until you settle in. And then we'll have a federal post office that will exchange letters from us, right? So the second fundamental problem is that we ran out of California. So there is nowhere further east to go. And now we're like, okay, we're trapped in this country together. And now we need to figure out how we're going to live together. How do, and our assumptions are no longer appear to work that well. So what happened, I think, to the United States after 250 years, the United States always, in a sense, viewed itself as outside of history, is this special country, is a unique country. But because we ran out of California, because these assumptions are no longer self-evident, the United States is being dragged into history. And when I use the word history here, I do it, and again, in a sense that there's eternity, and the way that eternity, as it's described in the Bible, gets physical form is history. Sort of, there is this idea, there's these principles, there's this pattern that gets crystallized, the eternal pattern that gets crystallized through history.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are living in the history that we all thought 250 years ago we left. And we left for good. And we left them for the Europeans.
Wow. This analysis says something like, thank you, England. We've fixed the problem, except for one thing. We've run out of land to give away as a part of our great conquest, and now we're back to where you were. And in some ways, it's the Roman conversation too of 2,000 years ago, which is, it seems like the answer is, and therefore maybe we have to be a little bit more imperial. Maybe we now have to do a little bit more of the controlling in order to keep what we have. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and that's the idea that we very much explore in Sovereign State in season 1, is exactly that. So that the new government comes in and says, okay, this thing is beginning to crumble. The unity that we have, the United States, England, Ukraine, it's beginning to crumble because Group A wants one thing, Group B wants the other thing. And they're about to come to blows because they can't have an argument about it. So what am I going to do? Is I'm going to put a strong man on top that's going to throw in jail the guys that say something he doesn't agree with, and I'm going to promote the other guys. So I am going to enforce order from the top, not through your moral authority, not through your leadership and spiritual,
or your martyrdom, your crucifixion.
Exactly, your martyrdom. But I'm going to impose it through power. And that's the trap that we fall for every single time, because as soon as you impose it through power to keep it together, it will stay together for some time. As we've seen, name a country, they had that period in their time. But sooner or later, this dictator dies, or there is a revolution, like there was in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014, and that whole system crumbles. But then how do we put it back together?
That's what my question. Good. We jamming. Is the answer then some sort of there? It's a spiritual unity of the people. In other words, it's something like I become more fully human, and that answers the question of sovereignty. In other words, I become more like God, and then the state can exist again. Something like that. I go on this journey toward my full humanity in Christ, let's say. And then all of us, let me put it differently. I, you, and some others, and a whole bunch of others. And the way to put back together what's broken is to simply become the thing that's beautiful. Is it possible?
I think you're right, but I'm not sure if it's possible, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's why we got
stink to it. Yeah, there's this utopian stink to what I just said.
and that's why we have the Revelations, the Armageddon, and because we keep on trying to
Right.
put it together ourselves, but you put it together by surrendering to Christ and you gaining a sovereignty from Him. We can't put the Humpty Dumpty together. We as humans. That's sort of the message that, uh, and what's left? Humbleness, loving thy neighbor, loving God,
Mm.
and you had a great podcast with Pavel, and I think you used this quote: "How do you fix a war in Ethiopia? Buy flowers for your neighbor." But that is so counterintuitive because there's a bunch of people that are screaming, send tanks. There's a bunch of people that screaming,
Yeah.
don't send anything, let them kill each other. Why is it our business? And these are the positions, but buy the flowers. Help a refugee.
What is just then I want to ask you right after this, I want to ask you a question just about sovereign state and if we'll be able to see it and how we can help or whatever. But do you just like right now, just you live in I forgot, I don't know this, Andrew. You live in Texas?
No, in Washington, D.C.
That's right, Washington, D.C. So there you are right now. Like, how do you look at all this news now? I think our listeners would really want to know, like, so what do you think about the war? Let's start with that one, and then I'll ask one more. What do you think about the war? And what do you think about America's interest in the war? Do we have any in that geopolitical way?
Well, I mean, I think at this point, let me give you a little bit of a longer answer. I think in my head, there are two stages to the war. Russian Federation originally came out and said it's not a war, it's a special military operation. So they're going to run in, change the government in Kyiv, put the right people in, and then Ukraine is going to be friendly to the Russian Federation and basically do what it's being asked to do. Let's phrase it this way. Now, Ukrainians won the special military operation hands down. And there was talk of, in Istanbul, the talk of a settlement. The sides were pretty close, but it ultimately fell apart. And I think at that point, it became a war and no longer a special military operation. When it became a war, it became a reason for the Russian Federation to unite in a fight against the enemy. Now, who is the enemy? This is the trick that the Putin did quite well. Who is the enemy? It couldn't be Ukraine. It's too small. The Russians would have a little bit of a chauvinistic attitude, and that this is like what we can defeat a bunch of Ukrainians. They're not our scale. So who are we fighting? We're fighting NATO, but even more than NATO, we fighting this transgender world order.
Yeah.
That's what Putin began to sell. And we're fighting the LGBTQ, we're fighting for traditional values, we're fighting to preserve family. This is the narrative that Moscow began to manufacture to justify why thousands of men die weekly or daily, I can't keep track, in this war and give up their lives. And, economically and in other ways, the Russian Federation citizens are suffering. Now, what's interesting to me, and I think that this is something that I want to publish this op-ed about this, is that the victory of Trump in the United States, in the capital of the Leviathan that Putin is fighting against, here you got a traditional macho man with the support of sort of, let's say, a traditional worldview behind him, and he wins it. So Putin all of a sudden losing the reason to continue this war, the philosophical reason, because the enemy is no longer there. Why are we dying to defeat transgender when Trump is as far away from it as possible, right? So I think that creates a window of kind of coming to some sort of a settlement, some sort of a an end to this nightmare just because the enemy has changed from the perception. And I think the key to diplomacy, the key to thinking, is trying to put yourself in the mind of your counterparty, trying to see the world from the perspective that they view it, so that you can build the language. Because, we started this conversation about people becoming rootless and losing their basis for understanding reality, understanding themselves within this reality. But the flip side, everything has a positive and a negative. The flip side is that you become, frankly, what you do. You become a cultural interpreter. You explain the culture of Georgia and Tamada, the country Georgia, not the state of Georgia, to the Americans that are not familiar with a social event where the whole point of you being at the social event is to be as open and vulnerable in front of a bunch of strangers as you can be.
That's what it is.
And we are so prepared, we're so accustomed to living within our forms. When you ask a person who you are, they always give you their job title. That's a very unique, it's sort of the Protestant American modern way of answering it. But I always like to say, it's not who you are, it's what you do. But there's a difference.
By the way, when I asked Pavel, the philosopher, the Russian, he said, "Oh," because I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Oh, you didn't ask me what I do." That's very interesting.
Well, because you got the country of Georgia, which I love, and I spent a lot of time there through my career. You got it in you. It's that, and that's what makes you culture interpreter. That what makes kind of brings people like you, bring the two separates together and unite them. And if I might go off a little bit of a tangent, and we'll come back to your question, because I just love this as an example of the pattern that I start using in my life, the biblical pattern.
Please.
Is the tetramorphic management, I like to call it. With the tetramorphic, when Adam and Eve get kicked out of heaven, there is a cherubim standing there with a flaming sword, and he has a head with four faces, that of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and a human. And then when you go to any Orthodox church or Catholic church, for that matter, and you look up to the icon of Christ underneath the cupola and underneath the top, there's always the Protocrator. There's four columns that lead up to that become the circle, and they're usually evangelists. And when you pay attention, John is always the eagle, Luke is the bull, Mark is the lion, and Matthew is the human or / angel. They're the two things together. And what is it sort of to say? And I think Matthew Peugeot in his book talks about it, which I really, really like. That's when I think I got the idea from.
I want to hear this. This is fantastic.
So what he says is, in order to bring the whole together, in order to come up to Christ, he integrates all four of these components. So they're no longer cut up like on the face of the cherubim, but they're one whole cherubim rather than the four faces of it. And what does it mean? What qualities come from there? So when we think of Mark, we think of the lion. It's short, it's concrete sentences, it's about action, it's about, in a sense, Christ's power, and it is the lion that it portrays that. So sort of the will that is integrated, it is the wholeness of Christ. When you think of Luke, it's so detailed, it's structured, it's the longest gospel, it's very thorough, it's very complete, and that's the bull, right? That's the work that you do. Now, the eagle, John, is the most mystical one. That's why I think it's such an important thing within the Orthodoxy, because we can spend the eternity talking about the Gospel of John and not get all of it. And that's the eagle, because it can see the furthest. And finally, there's Matthew, the angel, the one that brings it all together, collects it all.
Yeah.
And that's the role. And, every single one of us has this divine providence for us.
This is it. This is the priesthood of believers. This is what we are.
Absolutely. And people like
we can offer the divine. Yeah.
You are the integrator. You are the angel. You get the people around the table. You throw a little bit of food, a little bit of wine, or not a little bit, a lot maybe. And you see as these societies, these groups, as this multiplicity is joined in the unity. And that's what automata is.
This is, I love you so much for that, but also you were so wonderful. But it is really one of the great gifts of that little country of Georgia. They have an art that they start with the art. And no offense to the Russians or to the Americans, but we don't really start that way. We start with the plans. We're good at it. We can figure stuff out. Like Russians can figure stuff out, man, in the history of Russia, that there's great accomplishments. But man, the Georgians start with the art of that unity. So yeah, you know what? I think there is an epic coming, an era coming where I do think the majesty and the mystery of art. When I say art, I know Americans are hearing like dancing or painting. It's not just that. Art is the ability to expose, or a better way to say it is reveal beauty, which is your invitation to truth. You don't do art without truth. I think people think art is about not truth. That's not what it's about, because there's something about beauty that has to be united with truth. Otherwise, it's just emotion. And emotion is not art. Emotion is not art.
You're right on it. It's entertainment, but it's not art. And that's what, within the confines of sovereign state, one of the thoughts that I had is that we are living in the news narratives, but we think that we're living in the news narratives. But in reality, we're living in the story. But the story is not being told because the story is outside what can necessarily be measured. The story is how the guy feels.
Wow.
And the emotion that the main character feels, that explains the reason that he might do it, or his worldview, or he tried something and it just failed. But it's necessarily complex. It's necessarily multifaceted, and any story in a secular space is going to have its limitations by the medium, by the fact of the subject matter outside of the Bible, because that's the story that doesn't have those limits. But what you have, and I think this is the difference between, there's epic myth and then there's the Bible. So the epic story is because you actually get to understand, relate to the characters. And I think of like Lord of the Rings is a great example of that, because it's more about Frodo going somewhere and dropping something in the Ring of Fire. It's about who he is as a person, and about what Gandalf represents as a person. It's about the temptation of Saruman that frankly we all feel, because I think Saruman is the exemplary character of the modern. He's trying to manage it and bring it all together through power. And power of the mind and experience. And that's what we're trying to do. We're sort of trying to remind people, listen, your life is a story. It's an epic story. You're living in it. And let's try to take a broader view on what's going on, rather than just exchange talking points that was devised by some campaign or the other.
Okay, so this is way down the road, sovereign state. In some ways, you want some producers, some investors who have the proper, shall we say, old world, because our pod, we talk about old world, but we can say Orthodox, but old world. In other words, this sovereign state is a story about the new world. It's funny, it's edgy, and I thought of the series with Kevin Spacey,
House of Cards.
House of Cards.
Yeah.
I kept thinking House of Cards. This is like a big production with a fantastic, Hollywood proven screen writer. It's here, but you kind of want a crew of Orthodox minded, or shall we say old world minded folks to be at the core, right? You're looking for that. Part of you wants somebody like that on board. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is this, again, is like from which vintage point am I going to be telling the story? Am I telling the story from within an office in Hollywood? within the with the constraints of the Hollywood. Okay, maybe it works, but what if there is a way to tell the story from the vintage point of you, Jonathan Peugeot, Pavel Shelin, the how would I like characterize this group? Let's say the traditionalists, from the standpoint of the people,
Vanderklay says this little corner of the world.
this one little
Yeah.
corner of the world. How what commentary in a accessible form can we give about the current moment in history that we're living in? And can we tell it in a way that combines the best about the Hollywood storytelling that is engaging, entertaining, but it
That's
also
important.
has the depth to it when you're exploring these themes?
Well, you have an ally. We're doing a documentary it's trying to do the same thing. Have a lot of fun, get involved in pop culture, but also tell this big, deep story of Christianity. So there's something good happening. Isn't it weird right now? Hollywood is we met with some people that did Hollywood stuff and they're very interested. Hollywood's not rejecting this out of hand. It's weird, right? They know it's good, but they don't know how to sort it. Does that sound true to you?
That's
They
exactly
don't
right.
know where to put it.
Exactly right. And I think the Hollywood is right now is a little bit lost in the sense of like it doesn't know what stories to tell in this political moment. It feels that the ground is shifting underneath, right? And what is at this point what is making the money is this big epic Marvel productions.
Right.
But it's the epic component that it becomes critical. But how do you like? There's always going to be sort of the buy-in. Let's not fix things unless they're broken, right? So let's keep on trying to tell the stories, tell the stories, tell the stories. But you see people and viewers, and what is Hollywood selling? Attention. It demands your attention, but attention is going away from that and going to podcasts like Joe Rogan, or name it, a bunch of other guys.
Or even Sound of Freedom was a #1 rated movie in the United States. It was this year actually, or 224. Yeah, and it was beating out some of the big Marvel movies. And here's the thing: people are ready, bro. People are ready right now. They're ready. I see it with the Super. I see it with our little restaurant that should be making no money, but it's making money because people go in there and they sniff out the thing you described, which is like, is there unity in here? I haven't been unified with somebody in ages. I feel close to this stranger. How is this happening to me?
It's marvelous because you're probably the only guy that is actually making money in restaurants. It's one of the hardest things to do because
It happens.
you're not selling the dishes. It's not even a sale, but you involve people in the sense of unity, of shared
When you coming, by
vulnerability.
the way? DC's not far. I'll put you up. Come on over.
I will. I'll be driving from maybe even this week. I'll be driving through Greenville, so I will give you a ring.
You know where I'm going this week? You just got to tell me. Give me a ring, though. I got to go to Utah. We got a new guy coming in to go serving first things. He's going to Sierra Leone, but we're throwing him a Supra like you just did. We do that when someone joins us for 2 years to go into the field. We throw them a Supra. So I'm going to northern Utah, not like even Salt Lake, like northern. So,
But
pray
can
for
I
me,
talk a
'cause
little
that
bit
stuff's
about
too cold for me.
what you're doing with first things? Because I find it just so fascinating, and on one hand, but on the other hand, is so necessary, and it really speaks to me because it's not about getting sort of a big money and then coming in and telling the dumb locals that they don't know what they're doing. And that's where I've seen so many charities. I mean, I worked in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Jordan, Mozambique. I've seen it all. And power is one of the first things that people want. They want to come home and have the lights stay on. Remind me to tell you the story of how we turned the lights off in the whole country when Pope came to visit Cameroon, which is a separate story.
Okay, that's our second podcast. Can we let's tell great stories on our second podcast. This guy has great stories, you guys. Sorry.
But what you do is you don't have, in a sense, that arrogance and that sense of like, oh, we know better. Let me teach you the dummies how to live. No, you actually take these people, you put them in a local community, you their challenges or their objective is to integrate with the locals. And then it burns out what you don't need, but it highlights what it is that the community truly needs.
I'm stealing your phrase. It burns out what you don't need. That because you as a big energy guy, can we just say this? We don't have time. My editor's gonna be ticked at me if we keep going, but I have to tell you this. Will you just tell me what you think? I already know what you're gonna say, and I've never asked Andrew this question. But when you showed up in Cameroon, I'm not just talking about you, but the business. What happened with the locals? They know exactly what to say to get all the stuff, right? All this extra stuff happens. Can you talk about that? Like, what happens when the outsider comes with the dough and how it goes easy?
You come in as the sucker, right? I mean, the great poker maximum is very true about any sort of international life, that if you can't spot the sucker in the first 30 minutes at the table, that means you are it. And when you show up in a place like Cameroon, I never been to Sierra Leone, but I suspect that's similar.
It's the same.
Yeah, I mean, you have hundreds of years of the locals having relationships, stories, understanding, trust, and you are just an alien in this thing. So the idea is, if you are the other, okay, let's see how we can take advantage of the other to benefit us.
Yep.
And that be that, for example, pouring half of the cement that you're supposed to pour into a foundation of the power plant and selling the rest of it on the side to let people build the houses, right?
And then my favorite thing is then the outsiders, us, we call them corrupt. I'll never forget in Mali watching my fellow villagers, and I went down there with them, walk down to this giant dam the Dutch had built and take out the stones from the dam and build their houses with it. I watched it. I participated in it. And when they explained why, they explained why. And they're like, well, number one is that was an agreement made between our chef, who is from this region of Mali over here, the Songhai. He's not even one of us. And he made a decision for us that ruined some of our crops on the back end of this river. So why would I not go over and take? So I don't even think the Dutch understood that they made a deal with a Songhai and they were working with the Malinke. I don't even know if that was a thing like anybody thought about. You know what I'm saying?
But
we could go on.
You speak, I think, to the very fundamental issue. All the people, and this is what we're dealing with, sovereign state, and that's frankly what we spoke for the entire podcast today. But you have a dam, a hydro dam, that is going to keep the lights on for the entire country. That's on one hand. Or I can have a foundation for my own house. And I tell you this, people are going to choose their own house every single time.
Yeah.
Unless there are two ways. Unless there's a power source, police guy shows up,
Right. You could get the totalitarian.
You can get the totalitarian. You can, or it's a complete free for all. Everybody grab it, and then you all sit in your houses without electricity, or your crops get flooded because whatever else might happen. Yeah. Or there's the third way. This Gnostic managerial class. Let's put the good managers together, and let's keep another good manager looking after these managers, and another one looking after them, and we're going to just structure it until we figure it out. But the only way, my friends, is let Christ metamorphosize your heart.
You have to not care almost. And then when you don't care, but you love your neighbor, the project is born.
Yeah.
We could go on. We will go on. You'll come back because I love talking to you, brother. And we're going to see each other. This is Andrew Favorov. Go look up his story. You can find it online. The AP wrote they really... I'm just glad to speak to you. I'm glad you're safe because it was a pretty crazy story you went through, man. It was pretty crazy. And as a writer and as an really a philosopher of sorts, you've written something beautiful that we're going to root for and hopefully see soon. So, all right, man, I'll include links. I don't know. You tell me what you want me to link to, and Andrew and I, that are my editor in Argentina, we'll figure it out. Guys, Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate this. I really do. So, guys, Andrew Favorov.
Thank you, guys.
Guys, dancing to music. Make sure the music's playing right now, Andrew. Otherwise, I feel stupid. Dancing to music like, dun, dun, there's Gallibardos, because I'm happy. Because I love that talk. That was... Do it again, Andrew. Gallibardos, I'm happy. Guys, we're getting traction. We're getting we continue to get really good guests. Andrew is helpful. I can't wait to see his Sovereign State show. It's going to be produced. The thing is, it's beautiful. It's well written. It's fun. Guys, become a field worker at First Things. In 2025, trying to put 5 new people in the field. Check us out there. Check out my writing at Substack. It's really more old world, new world. It's conversations about things we've lost and how actually they're still with us if we just pay attention. Things we've lost are actually present in us because we remain human, but we just don't express some of the things we've lost. Like, for instance, the idea of honor. How does it play out in the old world? Well, I know. My guys in the field know because they often see it. How does dishonor play out in the world, what we call old? Well, it plays out differently. We talk about it in our Substack, lots of stuff. The last one I did one of the last ones was on marriage, how that works. And we just wrote another one. I can't even remember what was on. Oh, it was on kids and why we don't have any anymore, or we have fewer. Next is pets. Get ready. The pet mafia is going to hate me. That's our Substack called Heavy Things Lightly. That's also our podcast. Why are we talking about rabbits? Was all of this until it's this. You can also find us on... I almost just said hit like. I've never said that before, but everyone says it. Hit like, hit subscribe. But also go check out our YouTube channel and Spotify and all that stuff. We're on all of it. Much love. Making good things happen in the world. Hospitality, Supras. Thank you. Keep coming back. Peace out.